All right, welcome to Unit 8 Deferreds. Now, a warning. I think pretty much everything you've seen so far has been pretty simple. That's part of what makes jQuery so powerful. It's very useful and it's very easy to use. This particular set of features is, to me anyway, probably one of the most complex areas of jQuery, and I think the hardest to get your head around. We're going to try to go a bit slow and focus on some simple examples, but don't be too terribly surprised if it takes one or two viewings of this to actually wrap your head around how these things work. So we've been working with callbacks quite a bit. A callback is basically a generic way of saying, I know that you're an asynchronous operation. You may take 0.2 seconds, you may take 2 minutes. But basically, you're asynchronous and I don't know when you'll be done. But when you are done, I'm going to hand you this function and I want you to run this function with whatever result you get back. Makes sense, right? Well, here's a simple example of that. I'm doing a AJAX call to an HTML file and I'm passing a callback and saying, basically, when you're done sometime in the future, I want you to run this particular function with your results. All right, well, what happens if we want to make things a little bit more complex? Imagine we have two different AJAX requests we want to fire, one to one particular HTML file and one to another. Well, one way of doing it would be to call the first one and then in the callback say, hey, now I want you to call the second one. And finally, in that callback function, when you're done, I know we're totally done. And that's okay, but imagine if we had 3, or imagine if we had 10 of these. The levels of complexity would make the code almost unreadable. There's also one other problem with this. Browsers can make more than one network request at a time. In this code, I've made things essentially I've made the second one basically wait for the first one. So I'm not using the full power of the browser. So what if I want to fire multiple at once? Well, now I have another problem. See, I'm firing 2 different AJAX requests, but how do I know when they're both done? Well, one solution would be to possibly use a bunch of flags. So in this case, I have 2 flags, R1 and R2. I've set them both to false. And then in my first AJAX request, I say when you're done, I'm going to set my own flag to true, and then I'm going to check the other one. And if we're both true, we'll run the final function. The second one looks almost exactly like the first one, but this time I'm setting my own flag, R2, and checking R1. Now again, this is manageable with 2 of them, but as soon as we get more, it's just going to get to be a real pain in the rear. Enter the deferred. So a deferred represents an asynchronous value. Now if you think about it, you typically can't say something equals the result of an asynchronous call. Looking at the code on screen there, if you tried something like this, you would normally get an error. Deferreds let us do something with that. If our API, if whatever function we're running, returns to us a deferred object, then we could treat that like a result and say, you know what, when you're done, I want you to do something. Now, this particular code example may not look a lot shorter and a lot simpler than the earlier examples, but once we begin adding more layers of complexity, working with multiple different asynchronous stuff, this will become a lot easier. As an example, I have multiple different calls. It could be AJAX, it could be anything asynchronous. One of the features that jQuery provides is a when function. And this when function can say, you know what, give me any number of deferreds, any number of asynchronous operations. And when they're all done, I'll run it for you. And it's as simple as that. So, deferreds. They essentially represent an asynchronous operation. Your code can decide if it should resolve or reject them. So basically, when I'm doing something asynchronous and I'm working with a deferred, I use whatever logic makes sense to me and say, you know what, now that I'm done, I'm going to resolve this. Or if something bad happened, I'm going to reject them. Deferreds have 3 different events that work with them. The done is run when the good result happens. Fail will be for errors. And always will be, guess what? Always. Now, you also have something called promises. Promises are kind of like a read-only deferred. And basically what that means is that it's just like a deferred object, but you don't have control to actually resolve or reject them. All you can do is just listen for the particular events, done, fail, and always. And what's nice is that jQuery Ajax functions, they actually return promises. You've been using them, or you've had the ability to use them, and you just didn't realize it yet. So just as a quick, by the way, the concept of deferreds and promises, they're all kind of rolling into JavaScript natively right now with something called ES6 or ECMAScript 6. One thing to keep in mind is that while the functionality, what you can do, is similar, the particulars are a little bit different. So keep that in mind if you try to use this particular feature in a modern browser and you don't use the jQuery library. All right, let's look at some examples. For our first example, we're going to make use of the fact that all of jQuery's Ajax functions already return to us promises. So I'm doing a $.get, basic Ajax, and instead of passing in a callback handler, I'm essentially chaining off of that promise and attaching a done function, a fail function, and an always function. What's going to happen as this is processed, if data.text loads OK, done will run, and then always will run. Let's view this in the browser just to be sure it works right. And here's the page. There's nothing to see outside the console, but you can see that the done function did run, as well as always. If something had gone wrong, then we would have seen the fail function and then always. In this example, we're not doing the chaining anymore. We're actually working with the response, the promise, and attaching stuff to it line by line. So really, it's the exact same functionality. I won't even bother running this because it does the same thing. But I want to point something out. Now, you know that line 12, the $.get, that is asynchronous. It could take 10 seconds to run. But it's also possible that it runs extremely fast. It's also possible that the Ajax function could finish before line 14 is set up, before the .done is attached. Well, guess what? Promises are totally okay with that. If that situation were to happen, if this were to finish in 0 milliseconds after it ran, and the browser came to this line, when it sees this .done, it will recognize that, guess what? It's already done. So it'll just go ahead and automatically fire this. Same for fail and same for always. Now, just to be sure that I'm not lying to you, here's an example where I kind of fake setting up those event handlers at a later time. All I did was wrap those calls in a window.set timeout to do them 4 seconds later. Now I know the Ajax stuff will be done way before then. Let's run it just to be sure. Okay, here we go, and we're waiting 4 seconds, and boom, there it goes. So even though I set up those .done, .fail, .always, after the initial asynchronous operation ended, jQuery was totally okay with that. It just immediately executed them. And here we have another variation of what we've done before. With .den, we have a way of handling a success and fail operation all within one block, essentially. What I pass to .den is 2 functions. The first being the success handler, the second being the error handler. Basically, what you're saying is kind of a different way, a bit shorter, of doing what we've done in the previous examples. Now I have 2 promises, one being run when I do a get on data.text, and one when I do a get on data bad.txt. You could probably guess what's going to happen. For the first one, the success will fire, and for the second one, the error will fire. Let's run this just to be sure. And there we go. And note as well that the DevTools showed the error we got as well. For one final example, let's see how we can actually chain multiple different async operations together with .when. So all I have here is two promises, one to get data and one to get data to, and I can pass that as a simple list into .when. Now, what happens here is two things. For .done, it will pass as arguments the result of the success argument for each promise. So basically, res1 is the success result for this Ajax get. Res2 is the success result for this particular Ajax operation. If you remember, the first argument was the actual text of what we got back from the Ajax result. So by using 0 here, I'm essentially asking just for that text. Now, if anything goes wrong with any of those async operations, .done will not work and .fail will fire instead. Let's run this just to see how it works. And there we go. I have multiple different Ajax requests, and then I have simple code to say, hey, you know what? When you're all done, let me know. This is a heck of a lot simpler than the example I showed with flags. So far, you've seen me make use of the promises returned by jQuery's Ajax functions. Well, what if you want to work with your own deferreds? You may be doing something with IndexedDB or WebSQL or anything asynchronous not covered by jQuery. Well, what I can do is simply create my own deferred and kind of handle it myself. Let's look at an example of this in play. All right, before we see the code behind this, I'm going to run in the browser so you can appreciate what's happening. What I've done is built a tool that does a search against GitHub. So I can go in here, I can type in jQuery and get a look at the GitHub repositories that match that particular search term. I can also come in here and search for something else like Cold Fusion and see what matches there. Let's look at the code behind this. All right, so this is my document.ready, and this is kind of vanilla stuff. I have a click handler for the search. I'm doing some basic validation, make sure you're actually searching for something. But note that I'm calling a function, GitHub searcher, which is asynchronous, but I'm working with the result. So this must be a deferred. Let's look at GitHub searcher. Well, it's not that complex. I use $.deferred to create a new deferred. I do my Ajax call, and remember, this is totally asynchronous. I return the promise from that deferred because remember, I don't want to let the person calling this actually resolve or reject it. I just want them to be able to listen to it. Now, what's interesting is that when this function's executed, this is returned before the Ajax call is done. That's fine. When I do def.resolve, we go back to the code calling it. At that point, the .done will fire. Now, so far, this is probably not that much simpler than me just passing a callback function to GitHub searcher. But let's look at a slightly more advanced example. And again, I'll go in the browser first. Okay, so once again, I'm searching GitHub. We'll do jQuery, we'll hit search. And hopefully you saw that pause there. It took about 1 second or so. We'll search for something else. This will also take about 1 second. And it's pretty quick. But now I'll search for jQuery again, the same search I just did. And when I run it, it's instantaneous. So what did I change? Well, the only thing I did is to simply add a basic cache to my page. Every time I find something, I store it in the cache. You can see that in line 18. Well, what this allows me to do is that when the cache exists, I basically resolve my deferred object immediately. So this particular API changed. I made it a bit cooler, a bit quicker. But if you look at the code that calls it, It's the exact same. It has no idea that it's been optimized, but it gets all the benefits of that optimized code just by using deferreds.